So Ellen Hammond with the Ag Water Quality Program is going to do today's presentation. This is being recorded, and the presentation and some handout materials are available on our ODA website under the SWCD program, and there's a training tab, and that will have all the sessions for this last week. And you can actually find all the presentations there, recordings for many of them, and the handouts for the sessions that had handouts. So go ahead, Ellen. I will just hand it over to you.
All right, well, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Ellen Hammond, and I'm looking at the list of participants, and I'm seeing Deschutes and Malheur and Klamath and Douglas and you. It's either Union or Umatilla or Umpqua. I'm not sure which, SWCD, and a few other folks. So this is good. We got folks from around the state. And I've been with the Ag Water Quality Program for almost 24 years. I started out as a regional water quality specialist in Eastern Oregon, and for about 20 of those years, that's what I was in various parts of Eastern Oregon. I came to ODA from the Malheur SWCD, and a few years ago, I ended up with statewide responsibilities, primarily monitoring, but also another program, which I'll talk about at the very end. And I've got a problem with my mouse. Upper Willamette. Oh yes, there was another W in there. Sorry, it wasn't Union, Umatilla, or Umpqua, it was Upper Willamette. Thank you for that clarification. Excellent. So this is good. And so I've got a problem with my mouse today, so it might be a little awkward in terms of transitions here. Like right now. Come on. There we go. So I'm going to give a background, some kind of nitty gritty about some of the water quality drivers for our program, and then I'll spend the rest of the time talking about the Ag Water Quality Program itself, and also how the soil and water conservation districts interact with the with that program. And for those of you who've never seen me, that's me in my natural habitat in a stream, working with kids, looking at macroinvertebrates. So the Federal Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, and it created a national framework for addressing water quality issues across the state. And while it created a bunch of requirements for people, for the states, it also left a lot of flexibility. So each state actually develops its own program to address water quality. So there's 50 different programs across the state. And in some of those, or across the country, and in some of those states, EPA actually deals with the water quality issues within that state. Although most states, EPA has delegated the authority to some agency or entity in that state. And in Oregon, that authority has gone to DEQ. So some of the requirements from the Federal Clean Water Act are that each state must do these following things. Again, they still adapt these requirements to their own state. So they must designate the beneficial uses of water related to water quality. They have to identify parameters that need to get monitored and criteria that need to be met. And the concept is that if those criteria are met, then the beneficial use is being met. And an example would be the use of contact recreation, and E. coli is the parameter for that. And there's two standards, one for grab samples and one if you're taking multiple samples within a certain time period. So each state must also identify what you guys know as the 303B list, which is the list of impaired waters. And that list is then submitted to EPA, and it's supposed to be done every 2 years. And each state has to develop and implement what's called total maximum daily loads for issues, water quality issues that have been identified. And so the state will identify a watershed or a certain reach of a river or whatever, figure out what uses are being impaired, what parameters are the issues, and then they will develop what's called load allocations, which means that they will identify what who the responsible parties or the responsible land uses are for that are contributing to this water quality issue, and then they will indicate something like these land uses or entities, they need to reduce maybe their bacteria by 80%, or they need to meet some standard like 25 NTUs of turbidity. And so each of the responsible parties then develops a water quality management plan that's part of the TMDL. It's a response to the TMDL saying how they're going to address their load allocations. So in Oregon, we got a bit of a unique thing for agriculture, and that is that the ag water quality plans, which I'm going to be talking about shortly, they serve as the implementation plans for TMDLs in Oregon. So are there any questions so far? Feel free to put them in the chat box or just say something, either way. Okay. Now, what's unique about Oregon is we've had a requirement on the books also since 1972, and it's statute 468B, and it basically says you can't pollute, which means you can't interfere with beneficial uses. You can't place waste where they're likely to enter waters of the state, and you can't discharge in a way that violates water quality standards. And this applies to the waters of the state. The waters of the state in Oregon for the purpose of water quality includes any water with a connection to other surface or groundwater. So this statute applies to just about any water body you could think of in Oregon. Remember that a puddle of water in on a dirt road is not likely to have a beneficial use we care about. But for instance, canals, irrigation ditches, they've got beneficial uses. So this state law applies to more water bodies in the state than like waters of the US. So when people get worried about waters of the US, that's the waters of the US is not as broad as the requirements in the state of Oregon. So I mentioned that EPA has designated DEQ as responsible for implementing the Clean Water Act in Oregon. Well, DEQ is also responsible for that state statute 468B that I just mentioned. So in Oregon, there's different entities that are responsible for different water quality issues. We've got DEQ looks at like urban stormwater, wastewater treatment plants, what ODOT's doing or the railways in their right-of-ways, and they're looking at all those point sources that are not ag, like paper mills or just tons of different sources. They also look at point sources that could be related to food processing too, like in Hood River, the folks that make juices and things like that. So all of those are regulated as point sources under the Federal Clean Water Act, and they require permits. And then DEQ also is responsible for working with federal landowners and managers and on issues on federal lands. Department of Forestry is looking at forestry on private and non-federal lands through the Forest Practices Act. And then ODA has two responsibilities. One is confined animal feeding operations, that are considered point sources under the Federal Clean Water Act. And that's why CAFOs end up needing permits. And ODA has been doing that for a long time, delegated that authority by DEQ. And since 1993, ODA has also regulated and been responsible for agricultural activities on non-federal lands. And this would be the Ag Water Quality Program. Any questions so far? It's a quiet bunch. All right, so what changed in 1993? And that was when we got what we now call the Ag Water Quality Management Act, Senate Bill 1010, and then there was another Senate bill a couple years later to clarify that Department of Agriculture has lead responsibility for implementing or for preventing and controlling water pollution from ag activities in the state of Oregon. So we are the lead. We have regulatory authority. These two Senate bills also clarified that we do not affect water rights. We can encourage landowners to irrigate less, but we can't do requirements that would affect their water rights. And when we say that the purpose is to prevent and control water pollution from ag activities, what that really means is that we are trying to meet water quality standards and TMDL, load allocations, not local allocations, load allocations. And so we do that through the Ag Water Quality Program. And so we lead the program, and what we've done is, as a result of our administrative rules, is about 15 to 20 years ago, we created Ag Water Quality Management Areas. And you can see those on the right. Those are the thin black lines. And for each water quality management area, we put together a local advisory committee, and consisting majority of landowners in the affected area, but these local advisory committees must also include a balance of interests. So there's a maximum of 12 according to our rules, and we look at, for that balance of interests, we're looking at a variety of different potential representations, maybe tribal. There may be a small town wastewater treatment plant. There may be environmental groups, fish biologists, Department of Forestry, irrigation districts, general public, high school biology teacher. There's a whole variety of different people that we bring onto those local advisory committees because they all have a stake in water quality. The local advisory committees then helped us develop the Ag Water Quality Area plans and advised us on the rules. Our rules tell us that soil and water conservation districts are key players, and we must work with them to the maximum extent practicable. So these area plans and rules get reviewed every 2 years. Soil and water conservation districts are key partners in that. And our rules require us to use voluntary means first to achieve compliance. However, if we've exhausted those, then we regulate. Are there any questions so far? Okay. So I want to mention the area rules a little bit more. I'll get into the area plans shortly. And so, as I mentioned, there's 38 sets of area plans and rules around the state, one per management area. And each one of those sets of rules has at least 2 rules, and one states that we can't, or landowners cannot violate the state statute. So nobody can violate the state statute, but that statute is actually a DEQ statute. And in order for ODA to enforce that, we needed to include that in every set of area rules. There's also a streamside vegetation rule. Now, because local advisory committees developed the plans and advised ODA on the rules, there's different wordings of the streamside vegetation rule. There's probably about 30 versions of it around the state. But essentially what all those versions do is require a couple things, and that landowners must allow vegetation to establish and grow and provide some water quality functions. For all streams, stabilizing banks and filtering out pollutants. That's seasonal and perennial streams. Perennial streams were also requiring that vegetation be allowed to provide shade to address temperature issues. And notice that it just says they must allow the vegetation to establish and grow. It doesn't say they have to plant vegetation. It doesn't say that to be in compliance, your vegetation has to look amazing. It just says that landowners need to allow it to grow and provide water quality functions. So here's just a simple example, and this is a seasonal stream. And this is the same property kind of before and after. And there's a pond that was collecting rainwater, and then it flowed downhill. And you can see that livestock had pretty much denuded the vegetation along the channel. And as a result of some changes in management, then you can see down below the landowner chose to fence off. You can see the fencing just a little bit there along this intermittent stream, and he's in compliance. So there's a question if there's a minimum setback for vegetation. No. And there's been early on in the program, because I got hired in 1997 for this program, so I was part of all these discussions. This is an outcome-based rule, and this rule basically says that you need to let vegetation grow to provide these functions. Well, depending on the size of the stream, you might only need a couple feet, or you might need 50 feet. So every location is site specific, and we evaluate if it's, what kind of vegetation is capable at that site. We have that whole concept of site capable vegetation, and we're not going to require something that couldn't grow there. And we're only looking at providing enough vegetation to stabilize banks, prevent pollutants in overland flows, and providing whatever shade may be necessary for a stream. Does that answer your question? Okay. So there's a subtle difference here that's critical, and that is that area rules provide only the basic minimum level of protection for the land in terms of protecting water quality. And so the goal of every plan is to prevent and control water pollution from ag activities. The rules are not necessarily designed for that. For instance, riparian vegetation must be allowed to establish and grow. Well, it may be 20 or 30 years before the vegetation is sufficiently large or dense enough to actually protect water quality. So the gap there is that voluntary part that landowners can do to help work towards having their land be protective of water quality. So the rules only get us so far, and after that, it's all those other activities that landowners do, and which of course soil and water conservation districts are perfectly poised to help with. So there's 4 aspects to meeting our goal of improved water quality. first, there's funding, there's technical assistance, outreach, all those kinds of things provided to landowners so they can make changes in practices, which result in land conditions being improved and eventually, hopefully, water quality. And as you're looking at this, you're probably already envisioning how your soil and water conservation district participates in these different phases, maybe through monitoring or through assisting landowners, etc. And so again, we're required to work with soil and water conservation districts to the maximum extent practicable. And so you guys are the ones that are mostly working directly with the landowners, along with other conservation partners. And you put together partnerships to help you get your work done. And ODA provides what we call scope of work funding. And the scope of work funding got started shortly after the Ag Water Quality Program started, and around the time that I got hired. And the purpose of the funding from the legislature was to help develop and then implement the Ag Water Quality Plans. That was the original purpose of scope of work funding. Then watershed councils became more active, et cetera, and now the legislature assigns the same pot of money to watershed councils and soil and water conservation districts, the same amount. And so then they get divvied up amongst watershed councils and the soil and water conservation districts. The soil and water conservation districts, the money from the legislature, which is actually administered by OWEB, comes through ODA. Every 2 years, your regional water quality specialist works with your soil and water conservation district to figure out what you guys are wanting to spend the scope of work funding on. Remembering that the purpose of scope of work funding is to help implement the Ag Water Quality Plan and to prevent and control water pollution from ag activities. Any questions? Okay. So the water quality program has 4 core elements, and I'm going to go into each of those elements and describe how the soil and water conservation districts participate in each of those elements. And we have 2 initiatives, strategic implementation areas and focus areas. I'm going to explain those. And then we have the program that I got shifted to last fall, which is the Ag Drainage Channel Maintenance Program, and I'll have one slide on that at the end. So area plans. On the right is the template for the cover of our area plans. And as you can see, you guys are listed along with the local advisory committee. And then we put your contact information at the bottom. The area plans, they identify what the issues are, provide recommendations, remind people that actually there's also area rules and ODA has regulatory authority. And the area plans also outline what activities you've been doing, what activities you, and by you, I mean SWCDs and additional local partners, watershed councils, NRCS, whoever, and also show progress you're making towards goals that have been set, local goals for water quality. Those are reviewed every 2 years, like I mentioned before. The soil and water conservation districts help us set up that review process. And the area plans, when we're talking about activities planned, et cetera, there's part of the area plans that includes a discussion of recommendations for making changes to the program in that management area. And it may be, for instance, that people at that meeting, the binding review meeting, are feeling that maybe there needs to be more outreach to small acreage horse owners because there's a lot of issues related to those kinds of facilities. So there might be a recommendation in there. There might be a recommendation to do more work in, Camp Creek or whatever. And so when your regional water quality specialist looks at the area plan, the recommendations, and talks to you about your upcoming scope of work, then there's going to be a discussion about how to address some of those recommendations that were brought up at that biennial review. So ODA has 6 regional water quality specialists, and I'll show you the map again at the very end. And these people are charged with working with you to on all these different aspects of our program, area plan, scopes of work, all that kind of stuff. And that's what I did for almost 20 years in Eastern Oregon. So your local regional water quality specialist is your contact with ODA. Outreach. All the landowners, they need to know what's expected of them, and both in terms of requirements and also opportunities for moving beyond compliance and really getting to where properties can prevent and control water pollution from ag activities. So ODA does outreach through discussions and presentations at the biennial reviews, information in the area plans about issues and solutions, recommendations, etc. We do presentations a lot to soil and water conservation districts and all kinds of other partners about our program or aspects of our program. And then we pay you guys to do outreach. Also, there's a whole section in the scope of work on opportunities for doing outreach. Compliance. So I mentioned that we try to get voluntary compliance with the area rules or the requirements. And we do that through outreach and just getting information out there through you guys, letting landowners know what the requirements are and helping them meet those requirements before we get a written complaint from the public. Another agency tells us that they've seen a concern, or ODA can also self-initiate an investigation. When that happens, we notify the SWCD and say, hey, we've got a complaint or a notification or concern about this property. Are you working with the landowner? Do you know any history about this property, et cetera, et cetera? And then we'll talk to the landowner and say, hey, we've got this concern. We want to find out, we want to talk to you about what's going on. We'd like to come out and do a site visit. And we would like to invite the Soil and Water Conservation District with your permission. And now there's a couple of soil and water conservation districts in the past, I don't know about now, but they were not comfortable coming out with us on site visits because they didn't want to be seen as part of the compliance or enforcement process. And I've been on a couple of those kinds of site visits, but the majority of site visits I've been on, I've had Soil and Water Conservation District staff with me, and it's such a benefit because they start the conversation with the landowner on local recommended practices because they're the local experts, and also potentially cost share options and all that kind of stuff. So they can provide a huge help to us on our investigations. As a result of the investigation, ODA may make recommendations or issue requirements. And by that, I mean, we may issue what's called, we might issue a letter of compliance that says, hey, everything looks fine, or what we call a pre-enforcement letter that says, well, we had some concerns, here's some things we talked about that you could do, and depending on the severity of the issue, it might say, and we'll be back in a year to see how things are going. But it's still up to the landowner to decide what they want to do in order to be in compliance or we can require things, and that's when it goes to enforcement. And in the state of Oregon, if you have an enforcement action against you, you are not eligible for cost share. And so going through that pre-enforcement process, making it clear that if there's a compliance issue, like in a year or 6 months or whatever, that a lot of the cost share just goes away, then that can also be incentive for landowners to make some changes. Any questions on compliance? Okay. So here's some stats from 2019. And on the left, you see basically the triggers for cases. And if you add the green to the purple, because I'll talk about the green SIAs shortly, about a third are ODA observation, about a third are written complaints from the public, and a third come in from agencies. And these are kind of typical numbers. We get maybe 67 cases a year, and they're coming in more or less from these sources in about those percentages. The types of issues on the right, those vary a little bit year by year, but most of them are sediment, manure, and riparian issues. And on the training website, there's a more detailed report from 2019 that provides a little more of the details. ODA can issue fines, although we do that very seldom. Mostly, we end up with letters of compliance or these pre-enforcement letters. And so we feel that our program has been very successful at getting to compliance without having to go to enforcement too often. So the fourth aspect is tracking what's going on and reporting on it. And we're back to those 4 boxes. And as you move to the right, it gets a little harder to track. And so most of the effort up till now has been tracking assistance. And for instance, in the scopes of work, you know, how many site visits did you do? How many events did you hold? How many landowners did you engage? And then on the ground practices, how many miles of fence went in, or how many miles a stream had practices along them. Improved land conditions gets a little harder. And that would be, for instance, maybe of how many, you know, what acreage had cover crops on it in the winter to prevent erosion in the valley, or looking at streamside vegetation. And then trying to show that water quality has improved as a result of the assistance, the practices, and the land conditions is tricky, but it can be done. But it's a lot harder because you've got multiple different influences on water quality. So soil and water conservation districts are mostly involved with monitoring, tracking by looking at the water quality monitoring if they're doing monitoring, and also participating in SIAs and focus areas, which I'll get into shortly. There's multiple ways of reporting the area plans. ODA keeps working on trying to make the area plans a better mechanism for reporting. And then soil and water conservation districts, you guys have annual reports, you guys have websites, all those kinds of ways that you can toot your own horns and let people know all the good things that are going on in your areas. Here's the program initiatives. And this is where efforts are focused in smaller watersheds. Small being relative and locally defined. And the purpose for these program initiatives was that there was a lot of monitoring of assistance and on the ground practices and reporting on that. But the question was coming in, it's like, well, yeah, but would you change? What did you actually improve, and did it make a difference on the water quality? So maybe NRCS spent $3.2 million in some watershed helping with converting irrigation and doing a bunch of other things. And did it make a difference? Did it really improve anything? What kind of bang did we get for that buck? And previously there was a lot of photo monitoring and things like that. Well, that just wasn't cutting it anymore. And we needed to be able to better show that we were actually making a difference on the land and also hopefully improving water quality. So that's why these focused efforts in smaller watersheds is to try to be able to connect those dots. So the strategic implementation areas and the focus areas, they're very similar in a lot of ways, but there's a couple of key differences. The SIAs were started by ODA as purely a compliance initiative. We identified a watershed, identified potential issues, addressed those issues. Well, the original pilots were considered successful enough that it turned into a larger program, which is really overseen by ODA, DEQ, OWEB, and ODF and W. And this is the SIs that you guys are now familiar with, where there's a compliance portion, but there's a huge voluntary portion. There's been $100,000 available to soil and water conservation districts to do the outreach to landowners and help develop farm plans, et cetera, to address both issues that ODA has identified, but also things that landowners want to do to improve their land and minimize any contributions to water quality issues. Now, SIAs, while they're focused on agricultural landowners, any other land uses can also be part of that SIA. So maybe you've got a bunch of industrial forestry, private industrial forestry, and they've got some concerns, then you can also work with them. Focus areas are voluntary only, and the SWCD decides on the focus area and they do all the work there. ODA participates, but there's not that structured compliance part. However, if we were to get a complaint about property in the focus area, we would go and address that through our regular compliance process. So here's a little more on strategic implementation areas. They're funded through OWEB, like I mentioned, and so there's really 3 big partners involved in these. And there's a lot of planning up front, working with local partners to figure out where to draw the line around the SIA, and soil and water conservation districts are extremely involved in this. And then ODA does a compliance evaluation, which I'll explain in a sec. And then SWCDs provide all this assistance to landowners, both that are identified as potential regulatory issues, but also who have other things that they would like to address. And then after 4 years, ODA's goal is that all the properties that were identified as compliance concerns at the beginning are now in compliance. And at the same time, OWEB is providing up to $25,000 for each SWCD to monitor improvements on the land or in the water column. And so that's where the local monitoring teams come together and come up with a plan that will hopefully show that this $100,000 that got put into the SIAs for the SWCDs to work with partners and landowners, that it's making a difference. So when ODA does the SIA evaluation, we're focused on 3 main contributors to water quality issues: manure piles, streamside veg, and bare ground. And we start with a remote evaluation, looking at aerial photographs and adding other maps to that, and trying to identify which tax lots may have regulatory concerns and which likely don't. And when I say things like likely and may have, it's because we do not determine compliance unless we're actually on site. We follow this remote evaluation up with a field evaluation from roads, public viewpoints, to try to confirm or actually change the classification we provided at the remote. So here's the 4 concern levels that we assigned properties. And the lowest is, it looks pretty good. We don't really see any issues. The second one, which is, well, there's no regulatory concerns, so it's probably in compliance, but maybe the riparian veg is looking a little sparse, and the landowners might be interested in doing something to help the vegetation along. The opportunities for improvement is in the remote. Either it looks like we've got a problem, or we can't tell and it looks like we might have a problem. But in the field, we were unable to determine whether there were likely no regulatory concerns or whether there was a potential violation. The potential violation we only assign to a tax lot based on what we can see in the field evaluation. So Wasco is a typical example here. This was one of the SIAs up in Wasco County, and we evaluated about 250 tax lots. And at the beginning, there were 7 that we had potential regulatory concerns about. And after 4 years, they had moved into no regulatory concerns. And these percentages are real typical. We've done about 35 SIAs so far, and we're finding that generally, no matter where it is in the state or how large of a boundary we've got, only maybe 3 or 4% of the tax lots are potential regulatory concerns. This is a map here of where all our SIAs are around the state, and those numbers refer to a chart I didn't put on here, which just has the names of the different SIAs. So you can see just about every county's had one. There's just a few that have not participated yet. So are there any questions on SIAs before I move to focus areas? Okay. Focus areas. So focus areas are funded through the scope of work, and you guys lead them. ODA reviews them mostly for the assessment methods. And so focus areas, we're looking at a pre-assessment, and that would be of either land conditions or water quality or both. Developing measurable objectives. So that means, let's say you're in an area and you want to address, you're really going to be pushing CREP and riparian improvements. And so you're interested in a pre-assessment that shows riparian conditions. And let's say your pre-assessment, based on whatever method you're using, that make it easy. 50% of your riparian area is not as thick or dense or tall or whatever it is that you're interested in. And you think you're going to be working in this area for, think about 10 years, seems reasonable. So what is your goal for 10 years? How much do you want to improve that 50%? Are you hoping to get 75% within 10 years? So whatever you think is reasonable, achievable, that's your measurable objective. Then you provide technical assistance, implement projects, and every couple of years you see how you're moving towards your measurable objective. If you find your measurable objective is unreasonable, you change it. If you're having issues in your focus area, maybe with landowner participation, because it's all voluntary and you don't have a good funding source for implementing projects, you might say after 5 years, we're just going to bag it and move on. Now, there's a question in the chat box. Can drones be used for inspection? Sure, that's up to you guys. 30 Mile Creek at Gillum SWCD is using a lot of drones work for their riparian areas. And actually, Malheur SWCD is working with somebody to do drone flights to look at riparian vegetation in their SIA with the complete permission of the landowners. So it's not, ODA does not use drones for any of our evaluations, but if soil and water conservation districts want to do it, that's completely fine. So I just want to show you, this is the cream of the crop in focus areas. And this is an area that over 10 years has just been awesome at being able to link the improvements in the water column with changes on the landscape. Most focus areas, we're having a challenge with really being able to show improvements over time, because maybe it wasn't a big enough priority area for people to put a bunch of funding in, or landowners weren't motivated. But this is Fletcher Gulch over in Malheur County. And what the whole goal was to convert from flood to sprinkler by providing pressurized water. And so over 10 years, you can see on the left, the percentage of flood irrigation, which is the peach, went from 60% to about 15%, whereas pivots and wheel lines went from about 15 to 75%. Now, Fletcher Gulch drains into the Owyhee River. And during that same time period, you can see that the flow coming out of that drain to the Owyhee dropped from an average of maybe 8 to about 1 or 2, and especially the total suspended solids that were draining into the Owyhee, the concentration changed from over 1,000 to under 50. 50 is the TMDL target. So this is our best example of what can be done in a focus area under all the right conditions. So there's focus areas all across the state. And right now we've got for the last few years, every SWCD has been required to have a focus area and spend at least 25% of their scopes of work funds on that focus area. But all the districts were invited to provide their thoughts about focus areas for the SWCC to have a conversation about looking at focus areas as we're looking at all the things that ODA is doing right now. We are incredibly understaffed because of not being able to fill positions because of COVID, and also some of our programs have gotten cut back, like some of our monitoring programs, because of COVID-related funding issues. So ODA is in the process right now of evaluating all of the work that we're doing to try to figure out where to prioritize, how to streamline, etc. Any questions on focus areas? Okay. So then there's this brand new program that I've been focusing most of my efforts on since last fall. So in 2019, legislation was passed that basically handed some of DSL authority for regulating drainage channels to ODA as a notification process. So the purpose is to clean agricultural drainage channels while also protecting the aquatic life in the habitat for especially salmonids. The main concern is in the Willamette Valley, however, and on the South Coast. However, the legislation is statewide. And so there's a lot of coordination between ODA, because we were given the charge of this program, but we have to work with ODF and W, because ODF and W is deciding different time periods where this work can be done, and then DSL, because DSL is one that actually has been regulating these kinds of activities for a long time. There's a bunch of requirements for landowners that address protecting wetlands, what kind of work you can do, when you can do it, how you can do it, how you should be affecting streamside vegetation. And the program, we're just getting ready for finalizing a bunch of this right now. And if you want a presentation on this, you're welcome to email me. Go to this website. It also has Tyler's information on it. Tyler is our guy we hired for specifically for this program, and he's doing presentations to SWCDs right now. Finally, for more information on the Ag Water Quality Program, here's the same map you saw before. Those different colors are the different the different regions for our regional staff. The regional staff are listed on the right side. And also because of COVID, we were not able to fill the 2 vacant regional water quality specialist positions in that darker blue area in Northwest Oregon. And so that area is now one region, and there's 2 staff are now assigned to that. Cheryl used to be our riparian specialist, and Paul used to be our hydrologist. They're now sharing responsibilities in that region, where Cheryl is doing more of like the area plans and scopes of work, that kind of thing, whereas Paul is doing more of the compliance and the Willamette Valley Guama groundwater management area. And all that shift just happened more or less in the last month. So Cheryl is probably contacting your SWCD, or already has, just to introduce herself and to have a chat about what's going on in your area. There's also the website on the left that takes you to our ag water quality plans. The first section of all of our ag water quality plans describes our authorities and responsibilities related to water quality and gives you more details there. Also on your training website, there's multiple documents about SIAs and more information, more details about how the SIA process works. So that's all I've got. Any questions, comments? Was this helpful? Did you already know everything that I've gone over? Anything?
Pretty quiet group today.
Yeah, not like Monday.
Well, folks don't have any questions. We'll end this session. Just to repeat that this has been recorded. It may be next week actually when all the recordings for all these sessions get uploaded. They have to go to our YouTube channel and stuff like that. So, but currently the handouts and the actual presentations are on the website. So free to go there and grab them if you want. And I think that's about it. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the day. Maybe I'll see some of you later. Otherwise, have a great weekend when it finally gets here. Take care.